Torah reference. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Because you have rejected knowledge, I reject you from being a priest to me. Hosea 4:6. Bible reference. Those who forget the law are cursed, but those who remember it prosper. Deuteronomy 28:45-46. Quran reference. Did they not reflect on themselves? Allah created the heavens and the earth and everything between them for a purpose. Yet many remain heedless. Surah Al-Araf 7:185. Before we dive in, take a moment to reflect. If you've ever wondered why the world seems to repeat the same mistakes over and over, this episode is crafted for you. Stick around, because the lessons from the past could be the key to navigating our future. History is not a straight path. It is a river that bends, loops, and sometimes crashes over the banks of ignorance. When societies forget the lessons of their past, when ethical standards erode silently over generations, the consequences are often catastrophic. What begins as a small oversight can grow into systemic collapse, moral decay, and repeated suffering. From the Roman Empire to modern-day parallels, the story is always the same. When knowledge is neglected, societies pay the price. Take, for instance, the moral decay in ancient Rome. By the late Republic, corruption had seeped into every corner of civic life. Leaders who once revered duty and honor now worshipped wealth and personal power. The Senate, once a guardian of law and tradition, became a stage for spectacle and self-interest. Ordinary citizens, gradually desensitized to injustice, tolerated behavior that previously would have been unthinkable. The warnings were clear. Writers, philosophers, and moralists all sounded alarms. Cicero, for example, lamented the erosion of civic virtue and the rise of greed. But the society that once listened to reason had begun to forget the principles that upheld it. Similarly, consider the fall of ethical standards during the European Enlightenment in some regions. The intellectual flowering brought remarkable scientific and philosophical advances, yet it also exposed cracks in social cohesion. Without grounding in moral responsibility, some societies prioritized technological and economic progress over the welfare of all citizens. The lessons of history, how unchecked ambition can lead to collapse, were overlooked. Small ethical compromises became habits, habits became norms, and norms, when left unexamined, shaped the culture of an entire generation. We can see the same patterns reflected in the Quranic warning about heedlessness. Surah Al-Araf 7:185 asks believers to reflect on themselves, on the world around them, and on the signs of Allah in creation. The warning is timeless. Ignorance is not merely the absence of knowledge. It is the refusal to learn, to remember, and to act upon guidance. Societies that ignore such lessons are doomed to repeat them. The Bible and Torah similarly stress memory as a foundation for survival. When a community forgets its covenant, forgets the principles that guided its ancestors, moral collapse follows. The link between collective memory and societal well-being is direct. Forgetfulness leads to ethical erosion, which eventually manifests in instability, injustice, and conflict. History is replete with such examples. And what is most striking is how predictable the cycle becomes once memory is lost. The human cost of forgetfulness. Ethical decline is never abstract, it affects real people. Consider the early 20th century, when many governments ignored warnings about industrial and social crises. Factory conditions worsened, child labor persisted, and economic disparities widened. Scholars, labor activists, and ordinary citizens sounded alarms, but entrenched interests ignored them. The result was predictable: social unrest, revolutions, and the rise of ideologies promising moral renewal. When societies forget the human consequences of their actions, or inaction, history becomes an endless loop of suffering. We see echoes of this today. Modern societies, while technologically advanced, often disregard lessons from the past. Environmental degradation continues despite clear evidence and warnings. Social inequalities persist despite centuries of philosophical and religious admonition. Ethical amnesia allows the same mistakes to surface, often in new forms but with consequences just as severe. Case study: the collapse of ethical standards over generations. Let's take a closer look at multi-generational decline. In Japan, during the Edo period, a rigid social structure initially maintained harmony and order. Samurai adhered to strict codes of conduct, merchants observed ethical norms, and villages maintained self-regulation. Yet as the centuries passed, the rigid codes became hollow. Economic pressures and changing values eroded ethical adherence. What had once been a foundation for societal stability became a source of rigidity and vulnerability. By the time external forces pressured Japan in the 19th century, the society that had once been morally coherent faced unprecedented upheaval. Similarly, in ancient China, dynastic cycles demonstrate the same principle. Dynasties began with moral and political integrity, but over generations, corruption, nepotism, and neglect of ethical standards weakened the state. Philosophers like Confucius repeatedly warned rulers and citizens alike that moral vigilance must be continuous. Those who forget history, he implied, invite disaster. Societal forgetting and historical repetition. There is a chilling pattern in human history. Societies that forget are doomed to repeat. The fall of the Roman Empire, the collapse of dynasties in China, and the decline of moral authority in European city-states all follow similar trajectories. Forgetting, whether willful or negligent, creates gaps in ethical and civic responsibility. These gaps are then exploited by leaders, by social pressures, and sometimes by circumstances beyond control. The result is an almost inevitable repetition of errors. Even religious texts emphasize this cyclical warning. The Torah admonishes, "Remember what the Lord your God did for you and do not stray." The Bible echoes this through countless stories of empires and communities rising and falling due to forgetfulness of divine guidance. The Quran similarly emphasizes reflection and remembrance, warning against heedlessness as the root of societal decay. End-time parallels. Some scholars suggest that the lessons of history are especially relevant when viewed through the lens of eschatology, the study of end times. Societies that collectively forget ethical principles, justice, and compassion are warned to be at risk of severe upheaval. Signs of decay appear subtly: erosion of trust, normalization of corruption, exploitation of the vulnerable, and neglect of moral responsibility. Ignoring these signs, as history has repeatedly shown, leads not just to social disruption but to existential risk. Modern observers note parallels in environmental neglect, political polarization, and the rise of ideological extremism. Each generation has the opportunity to learn from past mistakes, yet repeated forgetting suggests a persistent human flaw: the inability to internalize lessons before consequences arrive. End-time narratives across religious traditions serve as moral mirrors, reflecting the dangers of collective forgetfulness and the ultimate price societies pay for ignoring wisdom. The late Roman Republic is a perfect illustration of a society that ignored repeated warnings. Economic inequality had grown unchecked. The plebeians, the common people, faced crushing taxes, inflation, and corruption that enriched the elite while impoverishing the majority. Yet the Senate, dominated by aristocrats, ignored repeated petitions for reform. Writers and philosophers, including Cicero and Pliny, documented the growing unrest, yet the warnings fell on deaf ears. By the time Julius Caesar rose to power, civil war was almost inevitable. Societies that forget the voices of their citizens and dismiss ethical concerns set themselves up for violent consequences. Rome's collapse into autocracy was not sudden; it was the predictable result of generations forgetting the need for ethical leadership, social justice, and moral responsibility. The moral of this story is clear: forgetting the people's warnings does not erase them, it magnifies the consequences. The French peasants' grievances. Across the centuries, history echoes the same warning. In 1789, French peasants submitted cahiers de doléances, detailed lists of grievances outlining economic oppression, unfair taxation, and social injustice. Many nobles and officials dismissed these warnings as trivial or exaggerated. Yet the grievances were rooted in real suffering and real systemic neglect. The result: a revolution that changed the course of history. The French monarchy had forgotten its moral obligation to care for the people. By ignoring repeated ethical reminders, the society sowed the seeds of its own upheaval. The revolution teaches a lesson that is painfully clear across all societies: forgetting ethical duty has consequences far beyond what the present generation can imagine. Andean farmers and environmental warnings. In a different context, consider the indigenous farmers of the Andes. Long before modern climate science, these communities observed natural cycles, rainfall patterns, crop rotation needs, and soil depletion indicators. Yet colonial administrations often ignored their warnings. Droughts, failed harvests, and famine followed. Local knowledge, accumulated over generations, was dismissed because it came from common people rather than official sources. Here again, the lesson is that societies pay the price when they forget the wisdom of those closest to the land. Ignoring repeated knowledge, whether ethical or practical, leads to preventable disasters. The historical record is clear: knowledge is powerless if society refuses to remember and act on it. Irish tenant famine warnings. In the 19th century, Ireland faced a similar tragedy. Agricultural experts, local leaders, and even ordinary tenants warned of the dangers posed by over-reliance on the potato crop and oppressive land practices. The British administration, which controlled Ireland at the time, largely ignored these warnings. When the Great Famine struck, millions perished. Ethical blindness and societal forgetfulness compounded the natural disaster. Ignoring repeated human warnings, voices of moral responsibility, amplified the suffering. This pattern is universal. Neglecting ethical imperatives and lessons from history magnifies the cost of any crisis. Russian factory strikes before 1917. Even in industrial societies, forgetting human needs leads to collapse. In early 20th century Russia, factory workers repeatedly warned of unsafe conditions, long hours, and unjust treatment. Owners dismissed these concerns, relying on state protection to suppress complaints. The strikes, protests, and eventual revolution were the inevitable outcome of a society that ignored repeated ethical warnings. Ethical forgetfulness is not just a matter of morality, it is a matter of survival. Societies that fail to remember the human cost of neglect invite instability, unrest, and sometimes revolution. When ethical decay is ignored, it becomes systemic, and consequences, when they arrive, are severe and unavoidable. Moral lessons across civilizations, from Rome to France, the Andes to Ireland, and industrial Russia, one theme emerges: societies that forget their ethical duties, disregard human wisdom, or dismiss warnings are setting themselves on a path to crisis. Forgetting is not passive, it is an active choice to ignore, deny, or marginalize wisdom, compassion, and responsibility. Ethical decay rarely appears suddenly. It accumulates, quietly undermining trust, justice, and cohesion. Religious texts repeatedly reinforce this truth. Remembering, reflecting, and acting are essential to societal survival. The Torah emphasizes remembrance as a moral anchor. The Bible recounts repeated cycles of prosperity and collapse tied to ethical behavior. The Quran warns that heedlessness is the root of societal decay and destruction. Across cultures and religions, the message is consistent: forgetting is dangerous, remembering is essential. End-time reflections. As we consider modern parallels, the lessons are striking. Technological advancement has outpaced ethical reflection. Environmental degradation, social inequality, and political corruption signal a collective forgetting of ethical imperatives. Leaders may be warned, citizens may cry out, yet the cycle often continues. End-time narratives across traditions warn of this very pattern. Societies that ignore the moral and ethical lessons of their past risk catastrophic consequences. Forgetting is not merely an intellectual lapse, it is an existential threat when multiplied across generations. The role of individuals in breaking the cycle. Yet all hope is not lost. Societies are composed of individuals. One person who remembers, who acts ethically, can influence many. Ethical courage, civic responsibility, and reflection are contagious. From reformers in oppressive regimes to whistleblowers in corporations, history shows that individual awareness can break cycles of collective forgetfulness. The key is awareness, recognizing the warning signs, listening to voices that are often marginalized, and acting in accordance with moral principles can prevent history from repeating its darkest chapters. Education, ethical leadership, and reflective citizens are the safeguards against societal amnesia. Even after decades or centuries of ethical decay, some civilizations managed to restore balance. Take the Meiji Restoration in Japan. After years of stagnation and rigid social structures, Japanese leaders and thinkers deliberately studied both their history and foreign knowledge. They revived ethical principles in governance, education, and societal responsibility while adopting modern technologies. The result? Japan emerged as a cohesive, innovative society. The lesson is clear. Forgetfulness can be reversed, but only with deliberate effort, reflection, and ethical vigilance. Civilizations that remember their foundational principles and adapt them to new contexts thrive, those that do not, collapse. Modern parallels. Are we forgetting? Today, the warnings are everywhere. Climate change, political polarization, social injustice, and economic inequality all signal that ethical forgetfulness is at play. Societies that ignore scientific evidence, social wisdom, or moral imperatives are walking the same path as Rome, France, or pre-revolutionary Ireland. For instance, warnings about environmental degradation have existed for decades. Yet industrial expansion, deforestation, and pollution often continue unchecked, fueled by short-term gains over long-term responsibility. If history has taught us anything, it's that ignoring these warnings leads to crises that affect millions of people. Ethical forgetfulness in the modern age has global consequences. The role of education and moral memory. One of the most effective tools against societal forgetting is education. Not just academic, but ethical education. When societies teach history with moral reflection, when leaders embed ethical lessons into governance, when citizens are encouraged to act with responsibility, collective memory strengthens. Consider Scandinavian countries, which integrate civic responsibility, historical reflection, and social ethics into education. Their societies benefit from relatively high levels of trust, equality, and cooperation. Knowledge without action, however, is insufficient. Ethical memory must translate into behavior, legislation, and cultural norms. Ethical vigilance is a preventative tool. Repeated history shows that ethical vigilance is preventative. Leaders who act with foresight, citizens who speak truth to power, and communities that prioritize justice create resilient societies. When warnings are ignored, whether about economic inequality, environmental risk, or social injustice, the consequences compound. Religious texts again provide guidance. Torah reminds communities to remember past lessons and obey moral laws to ensure survival. Bible warns that forgetting divine guidance and moral responsibility brings ruin. Quran repeatedly emphasizes reflection, heedfulness, and societal responsibility as foundations of human survival. This shows that ethical vigilance is universal, not just a societal choice but a moral imperative. Historical case study. The collapse of ethical norms in Europe. Take the industrialization era in Europe. Factories emerged, economies boomed, yet labor conditions deteriorated, child exploitation rose, and social inequality widened. Repeated warnings from thinkers, writers, and reformers went ignored. Revolutions, labor strikes, and civil unrest followed. Ethical forgetting had consequences. Economic growth alone could not prevent societal breakdowns when human welfare was ignored. Similar patterns emerge across continents. The neglect of social, environmental, and moral responsibilities eventually results in predictable crises. History's lessons are consistent. Forgetting leads to suffering, repeating cycles of ignorance, and, ultimately, collapse. Individual responsibility. Breaking the cycle. Even when societies collectively forget, individual action can disrupt cycles of ignorance. People who question authority, speak truth, and act ethically become catalysts for change. Gandhi in India, Martin Luther King Jr. in the United States, and countless other reformers show that one person's ethical commitment can ripple across entire societies. Modern parallels exist too. Whistleblowers exposing corporate or governmental neglect, activists raising awareness about climate change, and journalists uncovering corruption, all act as ethical memory keepers. Their work prevents collective forgetting from turning into catastrophe. Practical steps to preserve ethical memory. Document lessons. Keep records of social, environmental, and moral challenges and responses. Encourage reflection. Societies must teach history with reflection, emphasizing moral and ethical consequences. Foster accountability. Leaders and institutions should be held responsible for ethical lapses. Promote civic engagement. Encourage citizens to act, not just observe. Protect knowledge sources. Scholars, journalists, and ordinary people who provide warnings must be heard, not silenced. By institutionalizing these principles, societies reduce the risk of forgetting and mitigate the consequences of ignorance. End-time parallels and warnings. Looking at modern challenges through an end-time lens highlights the urgency. Ethical forgetting manifests in environmental disasters, social inequalities, and moral erosion. Leaders may face repeated warnings about crises, yet without reflection and action, the consequences multiply. End-time narratives, across religious traditions, warn societies that forget or ignore moral guidance. The collapse is often not sudden. It is cumulative, silent, and devastating. Modern society stands at a crossroads. We can learn from the past, act on ethical warnings, and preserve moral memory, or we can ignore repeated signals, risking large-scale disruption, suffering, and potentially irreversible consequences. History is a teacher, yet its lessons are ignored more often than remembered. From ancient Rome to modern global crises, the pattern is striking. Forgetfulness leads to decline, vigilance fosters resilience. Ethical memory, civic responsibility, and moral courage are not abstract ideals. They are survival tools for societies. If you've stayed with me this far, take a moment to reflect on your own role in this story. How can you preserve memory, act ethically, and speak up when warnings go unheeded. Share your thoughts in the comments, discuss with friends, and let's start building a society that remembers, so we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. Remember, the cost of ignorance is not only historical, it is personal, societal, and global. But the power to change, to break the cycle, is in your hands.